Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I am the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by John Cassidy. He is a staff writer at The New Yorker. He is the author of the books How Markets Fail, The Logic of Economic Calamities, and most recently, the book that we are here to talk to him about today, Capitalism and Its Critics, a history from the Industrial Revolution to AI. John Cassidy, thank you for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thanks very much for inviting me on. Delighted to be here.
Well, first, congratulations on this book, because it really is just a momentous achievement. It is one of those books that is called magisterial, because it is a sweeping history of the criticisms of capitalism across the centuries, profiling dozens of fascinating figures, tracking the evolution of capitalism, tracking the evolution of pro-capitalist ideas, of anti-capitalist ideas. It's totally fascinating, totally rich, and I was totally baffled as to how I could possibly have a conversation with you about it, because there's so much to cover within the half hour here. So we're only going to be able to scratch the surface here. So let me start by asking you, John Cassidy, why criticize capitalism? Why would anyone have criticized capitalism, the foundation of our prosperity, the system that has given us untold wealth, lifted all boats, and created the modern world as we know it? What spurred so much criticism?
Well, it's been criticism since day one, or actually before day one. My first critic in the book sort of predates industrial capitalism. Let's start with the basics. Where does capitalism come from, and where do I start? The book basically starts in 1770 with the first cotton factories. That's when the Industrial Revolution is usually dated to. So the book is really about industrial capitalism, but I'm not saying this was something completely new, because there was mercantile capitalism before that. So the two first critics in the book are critics of mercantile capitalism. Mercantile capitalism was colonial capitalism based on, colonial monopolies like the East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, the African Company. Lots of the companies were involved in the slave trade, involved in all sorts of spices trades. Anyway, the first one is you say, why would anybody be critical of capitalism? Well, my first critic was critical of it. Is basically a critic of large corporations. He was a whistleblower for the East India Company who fell out with his bosses and got fired, and wrote a sort of tell-all claiming that they were exploiting the people in India who they bought stuff from. They were a trading company, and also exploiting the British consumer by overcharging, etc., etc. The second critic in the book is Adam Smith.
Yeah, people might be surprised to have him included in the critics of capitalism.
Exactly. Why is Adam Smith in a book about critics of capitalism? Because he actually wrote The Wealth of Nations, which fortunately comes out in 1776, so it's all sort of maps up with the start of my book. He says in the introduction to Wealth, he wrote this book as an attack on the mercantile system, as an attack on mercantile capitalism, which is sort of protectionist, monopolistic, sort of capitalism Donald Trump's trying to resurrect as we speak. Adam Smith was a big defender of free markets, free enterprise. He said we didn't need protection, tariffs, etc. Free trade will deliver all these goods that we're getting from all over the world anyway. He didn't say we didn't need slavery. You could hire all the workers on the open market. So my first two critics, as I say, are critics of the previous form of capitalism. Now, you get on to industrial capitalism, and I acknowledge this is a history rather than a sort of political tract. I try to be fair, and one of the first, there are only two charts in the book. First chart is the famous hockey chart, which I think is in chapter 1 or 2, which shows how GDP, wealth, whatever you want to call it, basically is flat from the year dot until 1800. And then takes off like a hockey stick.
Yes.
It's gone up.
Nothing for most of human history, and then suddenly the explosion.
Exactly. So,
although that is a point, and that is a chart that Karl Marx wouldn't necessarily have disputed.
No, that's what I mean. Marx, of course, one of the things Marx recognized was the productivity of capitalism. The debates have never been about whether capitalism is a productive system. Well, not even among the sort of orthodox left and right. It's been about the sort of failures and contradictions that come along with that enormous growth that we've had. things like inequality, poverty, worker exploitation, consumer exploitation, etc. These themes recur throughout the system. And even as if you just look at the chart, you think, well, we're getting richer and richer and richer. Yeah. It's always been a contested system from the very first day until today.
It is kind of fascinating when you dive into the lives and ideas of these figures that you discover. Many of them are complex. That Adam Smith, in an intro to economics textbook, Adam Smith would be presented as the exponent of free market capitalism, Karl Marx as the critic, but then you have Karl Marx paying tribute to capitalism's great productivity. And you point out, as you said, that Adam Smith is... in your phrase, a noted critic of capitalism, as well as its greatest philosopher, criticizing colonialism, as you say, deeply suspicious of individual business owners as well as merchant capitalist enterprises. I mean, he has phrases about the way in which the masters of mankind, I think he calls them, are always trying to get more for themselves. That make him sound like parts. If you isolated those parts, you might think he was a socialist.
Well, you certainly think he was Lena Khan. I mean, he had him and Lena Khan would have got along great because, as you said, he has a famous phrase about you never see more than three businessmen getting together than they sort of conspire to raise prices. He saw business as sort of a necessary, not necessary even anyway, but as innately sort of having monopolistic tendencies if it wasn't controlled. He's not the proponent of sort of corporate capitalism. He's a proponent of free markets, free market competition. His famous descriptions of pin factories and how the butcher defends on 50 different people for his living. He sees the market and competition as the sort of the great driving positive forces. And he thinks people at all sides, governments, colonial monopolies, and I'm sure if we came back today, sort of internet monopolies, sort of frustrating the workings of the market.
I mentioned there the multitudes contained within Adam Smith and Karl Marx, and it seems that another kind of complexity that comes out of your book is that the criticisms of capitalism are both simple and consistent, and also diverse and complex. You say in the book, the central indictment of capitalism has remained remarkably consistent across the hundreds of years and many continents that you trace it over. You say it's soulless, it's exploitative, it's inequitable, unstable, destructive, yet also all-conquering and overwhelming. We can detect that theme, that thread throughout the thinkers of the book. But at the same time, the many, many thinkers of the book are all bringing in very kind of diverse. Not all criticism of capitalism is the same. There are so many different flavors of it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, I think you're exactly right. What I tried to, it's a narrative. It's not just a collection of different things. I didn't want it to be just sort of encyclopedia entries. So the things that pull the narrative together are the sort of these themes, these critical themes which run through the book. And they come back in all sorts of different guises. They don't necessarily come back in the same guise. I mean, a classic example of this is one other early set of critics are the Luddites in northern industrial England. It was sort of the first mass protest movement against industrial capitalism. And, Luddites for the last 200 years basically been a term of abuse to call somebody a Luddite, basically saying they're anti-modernity, anti-technology, etc. and, stupid. Now, suddenly, people are saying, well, maybe they weren't so stupid after all when they see the threats of AI, and it's not just coming from manual workers, it may be coming from, people like us with advanced degrees. And
the editors and writers, we're next.
White-collar jobs. You suddenly think, well, maybe the Luddites, had a point. So that's the sort of technological displacement is a theme that runs throughout capitalism. And again, it shows the sort of Janus-faced nature of the system. On one side, it's a very positive thing because technology brings higher productivity, which is the basis of economic growth and sort of wealth and living standards over the long term. But it can be incredibly destructive in the short term if you're on the sharp end of it. And that's what we've seen in that's what we saw in the Luddites. But you also saw it in industrial America. Saw that in sort of automation in the 80s and 90s. And then if you add sort of globalization on top of that, which was technologically enabled, you see the sort of destructive sides as well as the productive.
Now, the structure of your book is you build it around people. I mean, each chapter focuses on on an economist or a journalist or a revolutionary who either some of them were ultimately people who defended the capitalist system but incorporated criticism. Some of them were people who wanted to overthrow every aspect of our economic life. But let me ask you, so what did you feel that we get out of this people-centric rather than idea or statistic-centric way of understanding the history of capitalism?
I think there's sort of probably two answers to that. Number one, I have worked at the New Yorker for 30 years, which is very much a narrative-driven magazine. People always say, "How can I get a piece in the New Yorker?" And I always tell them, "You have to have a story to tell. A theme is not enough, or an idea. It's all narrative." So I've been trying to turn sort of complicated economic ideas into narratives for 30 years. That's what I do for a living. So it was sort of natural for me to adopt this. And then secondly, I had a sort of bit of a role model in mind. There's a famous book written in the middle of the 20th century called Worldly Philosophers by Bob Heilbronner about, the great thinkers of history. And he adopted a biographical novel approach. And I think it made it a lot easier to read, especially for non-economists. How many other economics books are still in print after 70 years? His is. So it seems to me, that I didn't obviously just want to retread what Bob did, but it seemed like that was a sort of good model. But he basically just did the great thinkers. Sort of only sort of half a dozen or so in the book. This is a much more kaleidoscopic attempt.
That's a good word for it. Because
it does follow the sort of narrative of capitalism. I start out very narrowly in sort of England, taking you through the Industrial Revolution, and then Marx and Engels arrive in England. There's one little detour across the channel to do Flora Tristan. But that's because that was the core of the capitalist system then. Then as capitalism becomes, industrial capitalism sort of globalizes, I shift across the Atlantic to sort of cover a couple of figures from, the great industrialization of the US, which, was basically sort of their China, when the US was the China of the world economy. And then from there, sort of the 20th century, capitalism goes really global, and it basically becomes a history of global capitalism after that.
Hi, sorry to interrupt, but if you like this video, please subscribe to this channel for more wonderful current affairs material in the future, and head to currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our beautiful print magazine today. So tell us a bit more about, maybe pick one or two of the figures from around the world. As I mentioned, you go to you take us to ideas in many continents here. You take us to Latin America. We hear perspectives from Jamaica, from former Soviet states, so these neglected figures who don't necessarily appear in, I feel like I've read a lot of socialist and capitalist literature, and there are plenty of people in this book that you devote whole chapters to that I had never heard of, who you're introducing us to for the first time.
I'd never heard of some of them before I started the research. I deliberately wanted to, for narrative reasons, to have a sort of, a diverse bunch. Some people some people you don't know, just because that makes a better book. But also, I thought it fit with the sort of narrative structure well. Let me give you a couple of examples. I had to sort of deal somehow with the whole Soviet socialist model, and I didn't just want to write another sort of history of Lenin, which has been done a million times. So I picked Nikolai Kondratiev, who was a economist during the Russian Revolution, and played a significant role in that. So you can tell the story of the sort of Russian Revolution through him. He was sort of involved in all debates about whether the Soviets, how socialistic it should be, whether it should be decentralized or whatever. But he also came up with a theory which has got global sort of appeal, and is sort of why people still remember him, this theory of long waves, that capitalism doesn't just have short cycles, it also has long cycles of sort of 50 years driven by technology, and they're called K-waves. Joseph Schumpeter, a conservative economist, picked up that from Kondratiev, and he introduced Kondratiev to the world, really, in the 1930s. So I thought he's a forgotten figure, but the idea of sort of long-term waves is still a very powerful way of looking at capitalism. That was one. And then, more obscure figure is J.C. Kumarappa. And because I had to deal with decolonization, obviously, colonial capitalism, and the end of it, or the sort of decolonization. And rather than doing sort of Gandhi or Nehru, who again have been done a million times, I cashmaned on Kumarappa, who was Gandhi's economist at the time. He was known as Gandhi's economist, and actually went to live in one of his ashrams. But started off as an accountant and actually did a degree in Columbia University when he was young, and then became a great prophet of sort of. He was basically the Indian when they achieved independence followed the sort of big industrial push model, the sort of Stalin. They didn't go as far as Stalin, but it was heavy industry was the basis of their first. They had 5-year plans and they had sort of heavy industry. Kumarappa didn't agree with that at all. He was in favor of small scale village based industries. And he sort of became completely forgotten because obviously the country didn't go in that direction. So he died as a sort of obscure man. But he's been resurrected now by the sort of degrowth movement, people in the degrowth movement, and he's sort of hailed as a prophet of sustainability and sort of a low carbon emission economy. So again, that's the sort of way that a theme which cropped up in the early debates in India, and suddenly 100 years later, it seems to have resonance again because obviously on the left now, I would say especially among young people, it's not the Soviet inspires young leftists. I think it's much more a sort of degrowth, sustainability, environmentalist-driven model. And somebody like Kumarappa, has got more to say about that than somebody like Marx, for example.
We're talking here about how your book doesn't just run through the pantheon of the great economists or the legendary socialists, but also brings us new or old voices from, for example, from the global South, people like Kumarappa, people like Eric Williams, but also your book has a number of profiles of women who have contributed to the criticism of capitalism over time. You introduced to Anna Wheeler, who might be the first socialist feminist, right. Flora Tristan, Joan Robinson, Sylvia Federici. Can you tell us about the contribution of women to the building of criticism of capitalism?
I was very keen to have a represent. I didn't. It's not 50-50, which I guess it should be in some ways. But I was there are two things. One, economics as a subject has really left women out for a very long time. Joan Robinson, who you mentioned, is probably the most famous female economist of the 20th century. She was sort of scandalously passed over for a Nobel Prize. But economics departments, both sides of the Atlantic, have been overwhelmingly male for as long as I can remember. I've been to sort of 4 or 5 different universities and studied economics there, and they're all overwhelmingly male. And that's true going back through the centuries. So I wanted to try and redress that balance a bit. But then the second half of it is women have always played a fundamental role in capitalism too. In the first industrial factories in northern England, there were more women employees than men. It was largely women and children because they were cheaper, and they could tend the sort of machinery. It didn't need to be skilled artisans as such. So they were, and again, same thing in the textile factories in Massachusetts, which I mentioned briefly. So women have always played a role in capitalism itself. Then their sort of participation went down, but women are still bringing up the family. Who's raising the workers? Who's reproducing the labor stock? It's women, and that's the basis of you mentioned Sylvia Federici, the wages for housework movement, which started in New York in the 1970s, and then which actually started in Italy, but the most famous chapter was founded in New York. And then it spread sort of globally. And their whole critique was based on, domestic reproduction, domestic labor and unpaid labor, saying that, housework deserved to be paid just as much as factory work, because there's one of the famous precursor theorists who I mentioned of radical feminism in the 40s protested at a Firestone factory saying, you can't run your factory if I'm not at home looking after your workers' kids and reproducing the next generation. That was a very powerful critique. It's true. I mean, there's no doubt about it. So, as I said, I tried to, that was a deliberate effort on my part to try and have much more representation of women in the book.
It's kind of cool that instead of a chapter on Lenin, you have a chapter on Rosa Luxemburg.
Right. Again, I sort of started doing a chapter on Lenin, and I realized, there's just been so much written about him. And actually, Lenin as a writer. I mean, I did do a section on his book, Imperialism is the Highest Stage of Capitalism. But I think Lenin, he was a great political revolutionary, a great political leader, but his actual, even though he was lionized by the Soviets, his actual theoretical contribution, I think, was largely sort of based on the work of others. The imperialism, his theory of imperialism being a classic example. I mean, he cites extensively the work of John Hobson, British liberal theorist who I have a separate chapter on. So I thought, well, I don't always want another chapter on Lenin. So then I thought Rosa Luxemburg, another, sort of neglected figure. And she's fascinating because she's one and at the same time, a fervent all-out revolutionary who ends up paying with her life for her revolutionary activities, being killed by the sort of Freikorps after World War I in the Spartacist rising in Germany. But she was also a very high quality, very deep thinker about economics. She wrote a very dense book called The Theory of the Accumulation of Capital, arguing that Marx in the original Capital had left out and made a major mistake in his sort of economic system, and that there was a sort of sector missing in his model, and this sector was the imperialist sector, the sort of overseas. That she made the argument that capitalism can't survive without endless overseas expansion, and she made it in very dense theoretical terms. So she was sort of she was in some ways the ideal figure, narratively speaking, because she represents the theoretical disputes, and she also played a first-hand role in a revolution.
You mentioned Kumarapa as an example of someone that most people might not have heard of, who's worth engaging with. We also talked about Adam Smith as someone who everyone has heard of, but whose work contains insights that are often left out. Are there any other people who we might have heard of, but in the course of your research, you found rich and interesting sides of their work, dimensions that we excited you?
I think Marx himself is a good example of that. I mean, I'd written about Marx. I remember writing about one of my first essays I did for the New Yorker in the 1990s was a piece about Marx and globalization. So I knew the sort of broad outlines of it, but I hadn't really studied him closely. And I think what surprised me most about him is he was in his in his writings, also in his private letters, he was a much more sort of a nuanced arguer and theorist than he's given credit for. For example, everybody thinks of Marx as a theorist who had this sort of theory of surplus value, this theory of the proletariat as the working class. It's a sort of inevitable model which is going to come around. But actually, if you go back and read Capital and don't just read the famous chapters, which everybody does, there's actually a lot of empirical research in there. He sat in the British Museum every day, and there's one set of passages which I report on in the book, which I'd never seen sort of people picking up on before. He has a sort of section, after he's laid out the great theories, he says, well, how does it look like in practice? And he has these sort of tables of British wealth distribution, income distribution in the 1860s, which in a way are sort of a precursor to what Thomas Piketty, one of my last critics, did in a much more sophisticated way. But same basic idea, how much of the income is going to the very rich. And Marx had that 150 years ago. More than 150 years. So that was surprising to me. It was a more nuanced and sort of empirical figure than I realized.
Which even Thomas Piketty didn't realize, because I think when Capital in the 21st Century came out, he said he didn't read the original Capital and it didn't have any data in it.
Right. Well, nobody does. I mean, I did. That's the thing. Nobody. One of the things. If this book's got any strengths, I would say. I mean, my defense of it would be I do actually go to the primary text.
Yeah,
I studied Marxist economics when I was younger, but I did it through the lens of sort of Schaffer and people. So actually, he didn't actually read any Marx, and that's what Piketty did. He read the sort of derived theories. He didn't read the original.
No, there's so much that you get. I mean, I find this too. Thinkers are so exciting when you go back to old books, out of print books.
If I have a message, is don't read the second-hand versions. Go and actually read the book.
Well, if people look at your endnotes, they'll find that they're very repetitive because you're just citing the original thinker over and over and over, right? Luxemburg.
But I mean, people say, what's the main source for the book? The main source are the books of the people I wrote about.
Yeah.
And I had to fill in, obviously, all the biographical details around it.
Sure.
There, I obviously relied on secondhand biographies. I try to source everything I did. But the actual original research here, such as it is mainly going and actually reading the books and trying to pick out what I thought was interesting.
Now, an important point here that also comes across is that you don't have to be a socialist to be a criticism of capitalism. Your book is into a history of socialist ideas, a history of capitalism and its critics. And there could even be right-wing criticisms of capitalism. And you have a chapter on Thomas Carlyle, who, gives very stirring denunciations of the all-powerful role of money, but is also a racist who believes in, strict social hierarchies. So,
proto-fascist, he believed in the strongmen. Yeah, I mean, I tried. I always think there's a danger if you write a sort of history like a book like this, it's all going to be from the left. So obviously, the bulk of criticism of capitalism has come from the left, so the book reflects that. But I wanted to try and include some conservative thinkers. I mean, I think maybe I didn't do enough, but I did do a few of them. And Carlyle is a very prominent example. And towards the end of the book, where I had to address the sort of current situation, I also tried to, reference some of the thinkers, in the sort of right-wing economic nationalist movement, the sort of American compass types, who were sort of questioning globalization from a sort of perspective which 20 years ago would have been associated with the left. So the moral critique of capitalism. I mean, I would say Carlyle's main criticism is a moral critique. He thinks it's, he says mammon, they used to call it the pursuit of money. He says mammon is, one of the shabbiest gospels ever taught to man. I mean, he sounds a bit like sort of, Jesus Christ running the sort of money lenders out of the temple. So that sort of moral critique has been there through the right. Now, it went away I would say, the second half of the 20th century, when right-wing conservatism became associated with neoliberalism, really, Hayek and Friedman. They were making the opposite argument, a moral argument for capitalism. I think, that's taken a bit of a hit in the last 20 or 30 years, a big hit.
But it's important in part to help us understand that if there's a crisis of capitalism, that doesn't mean there'll necessarily be a rush to embrace egalitarian and left-wing thinking.
Well, I mean, another important thinker in that regard is Polanyi, Karl Polanyi, Austrian theorist, who I have a chapter on. And Polanyi was, grew up in Hungary and Vienna, and was in the sort of Red Vienna in the 1920s, the great socialist experiment. And but then Austria was taken over by the fascists, Dollfuss, etc., in the 1930s, and he fled to London and then moved over to the US, where he wrote his famous book, The Great Transformation. But anyway, in the 1930s, in some ways, it was a sort of, more extreme version of what we've got now. Capitalism was sort of being attacked from all sides. And obviously, the fascism was rising. Polanyi wrote a series of papers saying that basically capitalism and democracy, they just don't go together. They're not stable in the long term. The only stable equilibrium is either fascism or socialism. So it's going to be totalitarianism of one sort, left-wing sort of central. He saw socialism in that sense as the sort of Soviet model at the time, and or the right way, Hitler, Mussolini, then 30s fascists. Now, for 50 or 60 years, I'd say that that seemed like a crazy argument in the sort of post-war era, where we had the sort of social democratic element. And certainly when I grew up, the idea that capitalism and democracy were antithetical would be, was very difficult, very hard to take in. But now, who knows? We certainly got. You can see, if you're going to say where are we heading, we certainly seem to be heading towards sort of, authoritarianism more than we seem to be heading toward right-wing authoritarianism, more than we seem to be heading towards left-wing socialism.
As mentioned, the book is so rich with all of these debates about capitalism that have occurred over the hundreds of years of its development, and we don't have time to go into all of it. In the discussions around capitalism's effect on the environment, on unrestricted growth, the relationship between capitalism and slavery, between capitalism and colonialism. People are going to have to pick up your book, and they are going to have to read it in order to get a full sense of the range of these thinkers and the depth of these debates. So let's just conclude with a final note on what do you think that going back and revisiting all of these people, both known, unknown, both people who are canonical in economics and people who are almost totally forgotten outside of the pages of your book. What do you think it gives us today here in 2025 as we look at the global economy and try to think about its future?
Well, I think it's a very good question. I would say two things. I mean, this is not a book with a sort of, one-line message that you can sum it up. But I think as a reader, I hope you get two things out of it. Number one, I hope it gives a framework for thinking about all the issues today. People get lost in the day-to-day headlines, especially around Trump, but in Europe, about the rise of the AfD, etc. I'm trying to present what's happening now as a sort of epoch in capitalism, a crisis epoch in capitalism. And if you go back, you'll see we've been in them before. I think the most relevant period to study would be the interwar period, if you're looking at today. But the debates that we have about globalization, about inequality, about worker exploitation, global warming or climate change is a bit of a different one. That's new. But a lot of these debates, they go back for centuries. So I try to give you a framework to understand it. The second thing I would say is if there's a sort of hopeful element in the piece, it's that capitalism seems to be sort of all conquering, but it's not immutable. There are different forms of it that we can change. There was a form of managed capitalism in the sort of second half of the 20th century, which worked very well for a long time. And from my perspective, as a sort of centre-left person from the centre-left, the challenge is to try and resurrect that model in some way, or come up with a new sort of managed capitalism for the 21st century.
Well, I hope anyone who wants to understand our economic moment and the hundreds of years that led up to it will pick up Capitalism and Its Critics. They will meet old figures in new ways, from Adam Smith to Karl Marx. They will meet figures that they've probably never met before. People like Flora Tristan, people like J.C. Komarapa, and they will engage in an adventure of ideas across many, many different kinds of criticisms of capitalism, from both people who ended up defending it and people who wanted to burn it to the ground. John, Cassidy, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thanks very much. It was fun.
Thanks for watching. This video is a product of Current Affairs magazine, the country's leading independent left print magazine based here in New Orleans, Louisiana. Go to currentaffairs.org to find out more about us, and currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our absolutely gorgeous bi-monthly print edition. Get it in your mailbox. You can also subscribe to the Current Affairs News Briefing, the Current Affairs podcast, or you can subscribe to our digital edition. Current Affairs is entirely reader-supported. We have no ads. We have no corporate backers. We depend on you. So please consider purchasing a subscription or making a donation to Current Affairs today. We are a 501c3 non-profit organization, and your donations are tax-deductible to the extent allowable by law. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching.